My name is Dana Mercer. I'm 38. And 5 months ago, I received a letter from an insurance company I had never done business with, informing me that a claim filed 3 years earlier under a homeowner's policy that listed me as a co-insured had been flagged for review, and that as a named party on the policy, I was required to respond to a series of questions about my knowledge of and involvement in the claim. The claim was for $43,000. It had been paid out 3 years before I received the letter. And it had been filed in connection with a fire at my childhood home, a fire I knew had happened, a fire I had been told was minor, a fire about which nobody had told me I was listed on the policy or that a claim had been paid or that my name was on anything at all. The house was my parents' house. The policy was my parents' policy. And my name was on it because, 7 years before the fire, when my parents had refinanced the house and needed to update their homeowner's policy, they had added me as a co-insured. Without asking me. Without telling me. As a practical measure, they would later tell me, because they thought it would simplify things if anything ever happened and they needed me to help manage a claim. They had not mentioned it then. They had not mentioned it when the fire happened. They had not mentioned it in the 3 years between the claim being paid and the insurance company's review letter arriving at my apartment. They mentioned it when I called them after receiving the letter, in the specific way that people mention things they had always known might eventually require mentioning. Before I tell you what the insurance company's review actually found, and what it meant for me specifically, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this story is landing somewhere real. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back. I need to start with the house. Because the house is not just a setting in this story. The house is the center of it, in the way that the places where we grew up are sometimes the centers of things that happen to us long after we have left them. My parents' house is a 3-bedroom colonial on a residential street in a suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My parents, Robert and Helen Mercer, bought it in 1989, the year I was born, with the first-time homebuyer optimism of two 28-year-olds who had just gotten married and who had decided that the particular house on the particular street, with its fenced backyard and its attached garage and its kitchen with the window that looked out onto the oak tree, was the right place to begin. They were correct about that. It was the right place to begin, and they had been beginning and continuing in it ever since, for the 35 years since my birth, through the years when I was in it and through the 15 years since I had left it. My father, Robert, worked for 30 years as a project manager at a regional construction company. He is 67 now, retired, and spends his days in the garage that was always the garage he liked best about the house, working on the rotating set of home improvement and hobby projects that retirement had finally given him the time to pursue without guilt. My mother, Helen, taught high school chemistry for 28 years, retired 3 years before my father, and has since become a person who takes 3 online courses a year because, she says, she is not willing to allow her brain to operate below its preferred capacity. They are good people. Responsible people. The kind of parents who maintained their house, paid their insurance, kept their records organized, and who, in the specific calculation that led them to add me to their homeowner's policy without telling me, believed they were being practical and organized and forward-thinking in exactly the way responsible people are. The refinance happened 7 years before the fire. My parents refinanced their mortgage to take advantage of lower interest rates, a perfectly sensible financial decision, and in the process of updating the various insurance and financial documents associated with the mortgage, they added me as a co-insured on the homeowner's policy. Their reasoning, which I eventually understood, was that I was the person they were most likely to call if anything happened to the house and they needed help navigating a claim, I am the organized one in our family. The one who manages paperwork and knows how to make phone calls and does not become overwhelmed by administrative processes, and they thought, in the vague practical way of people who are trying to solve a potential future problem, that having me on the policy would make it easier for me to help them if that situation ever arose. They did not think to tell me. Or they thought to tell me and did not get around to it. Or they told themselves it was the kind of thing that would come up naturally if it ever became relevant. These are the three possibilities, and I have not been able to determine which of them is accurate because my parents, when I eventually asked directly, gave me a version of events that combined elements of all three in a way that suggested the question of why I had not been told was one they had not themselves fully resolved. The fire happened 3 years before the review letter. It happened in October, a kitchen fire, electrical in origin, that started in the early evening when my parents were both home, and that was, by the time I heard about it, being described as controlled and minor. My mother called me the day after the fire. She said, "We had a small fire." I said, "What happened?" She said, "An electrical issue in the kitchen, the wiring behind the outlet near the stove." The fire department came, they got it under control quickly. No one was hurt, we're fine. I said, "How much damage?" She said, "The kitchen took the worst of it, some smoke damage into the dining room. Your father is already talking to contractors." I said, "Do you need help with anything?" She said, No, we're managing, your father has it handled." I believed her. I had no reason not to believe her. And I had no reason to think that the claim my parents subsequently filed with their homeowner's insurance company had anything to do with me, because I did not know I was on the policy. The $43,000 claim covered the kitchen renovation and smoke remediation. I know this now. At the time, I knew only that my parents had had a kitchen fire, that they had described it as manageable, and that the kitchen had been renovated in the months following the fire, which I had noticed when I visited at Christmas and had thought was a nice improvement without thinking to wonder how it had been funded. The review letter arrived on a Thursday. I read it at my kitchen table with the specific methodical attention I bring to official correspondence, reading each paragraph carefully before moving to the next, making sure I understood the full context before arriving at any conclusions. The letter was from the insurance company's claims review department. It explained that the company conducted periodic reviews of paid claims above a certain threshold. It explained that I was listed as a co-insured on the policy under which the claim had been paid. It explained that as a named party on the policy, I was potentially considered a party to the claim and was therefore being asked to confirm my knowledge of and involvement in the claim, the damage that precipitated it, and the circumstances of the fire. I read the letter 3 times. Then I called my parents. My father answered. I said, "Dad, I need to tell you about something. I received a letter today from your homeowner's insurance company." He said, "Oh. That specific oh. Not a surprised oh. This has arrived oh." I said, "It says I'm listed as a co-insured on your policy." He said, "Yes, we added you when we refinanced." I said, "When did you add me?" He said, "About 7 years ago." I said, "Dad, did you tell me you added me?" He said, "I thought we mentioned it." I said, "You did not mention it." He said, "I may have intended to mention it and not gotten around to it." I said, "Dad, an insurance review letter arrived at my apartment today about a claim filed under a policy I didn't know I was on, for a fire I was told was minor. Can you explain to me what the claim covered?" He said, "The kitchen renovation and the smoke remediation." I said, $43,000? He said, "The kitchen was in worse shape than we initially described." I said, "How much worse?" He said, "Significantly worse." I said, and you didn't think I needed to know I was on the policy when this was happening? He was quiet. Then he said, I didn't think it would affect you. I said, the insurance company is now asking me to confirm my knowledge of a claim I didn't know existed, filed under a policy I didn't know I was on, related to damage you described to me as minor. How exactly does that not affect me? I want to tell you about what happened after that call, because the immediate practical situation was something I needed to manage very carefully, and because managing it required me to understand, quickly and completely, what my actual legal position was as a named party on a homeowner's policy under which a claim had been paid. I called an attorney. Her name was Catherine Park, a woman who specialized in insurance law and who had been recommended to me by a colleague. I told her the situation in the order it had arrived, the review letter, the call with my father, the information I had gathered from the conversation. Catherine listened without interrupting. Then she said, Dana, I need to ask you some specific questions. The first is whether you had any actual knowledge of the fire and its extent before the claim was filed. I said, I knew a fire happened. I was told it was minor. I was not told about the extent of the damage, and I was not told about the claim. She said, did you sign anything related to the claim? I said, not to my knowledge. She said, were you consulted during the claims process? I said, no. She said, did you receive any of the claim proceeds? I said, no. She said, okay. She said it in the specific way of attorneys who have just clarified the essential facts and are now organizing them into a position. She said, your position, based on what you've described, is that you were a nominal co-insured who was not involved in the claim, had no knowledge of its scope, did not participate in its filing, and did not benefit from its proceeds. That is a defensible position and a truthful one. I said, what is the review actually looking for? She said, insurance reviews at this threshold are sometimes routine and sometimes triggered by a specific flag in the claim data. I want to find out which this is before you respond. She said, I am going to contact the review department and request the specific basis for the review before we draft your response. I said, how long will that take? She said, a week, perhaps 2. I said, is there anything I should do in the meantime? She said, do not contact your parents about the specific details of the claim until I've had a chance to understand what the review is actually about. I said, why? She said, because if the review has identified a discrepancy in the claim documentation and your parents have information about that discrepancy, I want your position to be established clearly before you have a conversation that could complicate it. I said, are you suggesting the claim might have issues beyond my not being told I was on the policy? She said, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm being careful. I want to tell you what Catherine found when she contacted the review department, because the finding changed the shape of the story I had been telling myself about what had happened. I had been telling myself a story about my parents adding me to a policy without telling me and filing a claim under it without telling me, which was a story about carelessness and poor communication and the specific organizational failure of people who sometimes make practical decisions without fully thinking through the implications. That story was real, and I was not wrong to be frustrated by it. But it was not the complete story. The review had been triggered by a discrepancy in the contractor documentation for the kitchen renovation. The insurance adjuster who had evaluated the claim had approved a scope of work that included specific repairs and materials. The documentation the contractor had submitted in support of the claim payment had described that scope of work accurately. But a routine audit had compared the claimed scope of work to the permitted work that had been filed with the local building authority, and the permitted work described a kitchen renovation that was somewhat more extensive than what the insurance claim had documented as fire-related damage. Specifically, The permitted renovation had included features that were improvements beyond the pre-fire condition of the kitchen rather than restorations to the pre-fire condition. And the question the review was asking was whether the claim had accurately characterized the scope of the fire damage or whether it had included some improvement costs in the damage documentation. Catherine described this to me carefully. She said this is the kind of discrepancy that insurance companies sometimes look at when they conduct routine audits. It doesn't necessarily indicate deliberate misrepresentation. Contractors sometimes document scope in ways that are ambiguous. Adjusters sometimes approve things that are at the edge of what the policy covers. The review is trying to determine whether what happened here was ambiguous documentation or something more intentional. I said, "Do you think my parents intentionally misrepresented the claim?" She said, "I don't know. What I know is that the discrepancy exists and that the insurance company is asking questions about it. What I also know is that as a co-insured, your name is on the policy, and if the review determines that the claim involved misrepresentation, the question of your knowledge and involvement becomes more significant than it would be in a routine review." I sat with that for a long time after the call. "I need to tell you something about my parents that I think matters here. My parents are not, in my experience of them across 38 years, dishonest people in any deliberate or calculated sense. They are people who sometimes make decisions in a gray area without fully examining whether the area is gray or whether they are simply telling themselves it is." The kitchen renovation had happened. The fire had damaged the kitchen. The renovation had improved the kitchen beyond its pre-fire state in some respects. Whether those improvements had been documented as fire-related damage or as improvements depended on how the contractor had characterized them in the paperwork, and whether my parents had been active participants in how the contractor characterized them, or had simply allowed the contractor to handle the paperwork and signed what was put in front of them, was a question I did not know the answer to. I called my mother. Not my father. My mother, because my mother is the person in our family who, when pressed with a specific direct question, is more likely to give me the specific direct answer rather than the managed version of events that my father sometimes produces when he is protecting a narrative he has been living inside for a while. I said, "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the exact truth." She said, "Of course." I said, "When you filed the insurance claim after the fire, did the contractor document any work as fire-related damage that was actually improvement work you had wanted to do on the kitchen regardless of the fire?" There was a pause. Shorter than I expected. Then she said, "Dana." She said my name the way she says it when she is about to say something she knows I am not going to find comfortable. She said, "The contractor said there was flexibility in how certain things could be documented because the fire had damaged the area where we had always wanted to update certain things anyway. Your father and I let him handle the documentation. We didn't ask him to change anything. But we didn't stop him either." There it was. Not a deliberate fraud. Not a calculated scheme. But something in the gray area that my mother had just described honestly, which was that the contractor had found a way to document the renovation that included improvement costs within the fire damage claim, and my parents had allowed it to happen because they had wanted the kitchen improvements and the insurance was going to pay for the damage anyway, and the contractor had made it seem like simply a documentation choice rather than a decision with significant implications, and my name was on the policy. I want to tell you what I did with that information. Not what Catherine recommended specifically, though her recommendations were important, but what I decided, after thinking about it for a day and a half in the specific way I think about things that are complicated and consequential, was the right approach. I called my father. I said, "Dad, I've spoken with my attorney, and I've spoken with Mom. I understand what happened with the contractor documentation." I said it plainly, without accusation in my tone, because I wanted the conversation to be useful rather than confrontational. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We should have handled it differently." I said, "Yes." I said, "I need you to understand that the insurance company's review has the potential to affect me, not just you and Mom, because my name is on the policy. Whatever comes out of this review, my name is attached to it." He said, "I didn't think about that when we set it up." I said, "I know. And I need you to know that thinking about it now doesn't change what has already been documented." Catherine negotiated with the insurance company on my behalf over the following 6 weeks. The outcome, ultimately, was a partial repayment of the claim proceeds, approximately $11,000, by my parents, in exchange for the insurance company's agreement not to pursue further action against the policy or the named parties. The review had determined that a portion of the claim proceeds had covered work that was improvement rather than restoration, and the partial repayment reflected that portion. The insurance company concluded that the mischaracterization was more likely the result of contractor documentation practices and homeowner inattention than deliberate fraud, which is the specific conclusion that kept the situation from becoming something much more serious. The MY name was cleared of any involvement determination. The review documentation noted that I did not know the claim, had no involvement in its filing, and had no receipt of its proceeds. Catherine made sure that was documented specifically and thoroughly, because she understood, as I did, that a named co-insured on a policy with a reviewed claim was not something I wanted sitting in my history without a clear record of my actual non-involvement. My parents repaid the $11,000 from their savings. It was not a trivial amount for them. My father called me when they had sent the repayment and said, "I'm sorry, Dana." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "We made decisions we didn't think through carefully enough, and they ended up being your problem too, which they shouldn't have been." I said, "Yes." He said, "We're going to remove you from the policy." I said, "Yes, please." He said, "I should have thought about what it meant to put you on it in the first place." I said, "That's true. And if you had thought about it, I think you would have talked to me about it first." He said, "Yes. I think I would have. I want to tell you about the specific thing this situation taught me that I think I would not have learned as clearly any other way. I am the organized one. I am the person in my family who manages paperwork and knows how to make phone calls and does not become overwhelmed by administrative processes. My parents added me to their policy because of that quality, because they trusted that quality to be useful if something ever went wrong. They were not wrong about the quality. When something went wrong, the quality was indeed useful. I managed the attorney, I understood the process, I navigated the review without either of us incurring the more serious consequences that an unmanaged situation might have produced, but the quality they had trusted was being asked to clean up a situation that would not have involved me at all if they had not added me to the policy without telling me. The organizational competence they had valued was being used to manage a problem created by their failure to treat me as someone who needed to be informed about decisions that affected my name and my legal standing. Being the capable one is not the same as consenting to be the capable one in situations you did not know you were part of. Have said some version of that sentence to 3 different people in the months since this resolved. My therapist, a close friend, and my parents. In the conversation we had a month after the insurance company's review closed, the honest conversation that the entire experience had made both of them, I think, genuinely ready to have. My father said, "We relied on you without asking you." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's a pattern, isn't it? Not just the insurance." I said, "Yes, Dad. It's a pattern." He said, "I'd like to change it. Not perfectly, not overnight. But I'd like to stop making decisions that involve you without talking to you first. I said, that's what I need. He said, I know. I'm sorry it took something like this to make it this clear. I said, so am I. But here we are. He said, here we are. I said, so let's be here honestly, I want to talk to you directly now. Wherever you are. Whatever time it is. My parents added me to their homeowner's policy without telling me because I was the capable one and they thought it would be useful. It was useful. And it was also, in the way that things done without our knowledge sometimes are, a liability attached to the name that we had not consented to and that had the potential to affect us in ways that had nothing to do with our own choices. If you are on a financial or insurance document you did not agree to be on, you have the right to know about it. You have the right to be removed from it. You have the right to be treated as a person who makes decisions about their own legal standing rather than as a resource that capable people in your family point at problems and trust to manage them. Being capable is not the same as being available. Being organized is not the same as being willing. And being the one who handles things does not mean the things you handle should include ones that were put in your name without asking you first. Check your name. Not just your credit report, though check that too. Check whether you are listed on any document, any account, any policy, that you did not knowingly agree to. The capable ones are exactly the people whose names get put on things without their knowledge, because everyone around them is confident that the capable one will handle it. And you will handle it. But you deserve to be asked first. That is today's story on the Family Ledger. Leave a comment wherever you are watching from. Tell me what time it is and whether there is a document somewhere with your name on it that you did not put there and did not know about until it mattered. I read every single one. Subscribe for the next story every week. Check the description for another one I think you will connect with. Thank you for being here. Really. It means everything.